This episode may contain content of a graphic nature, including descriptions of physical and sexual violence against adults, children, and animals. Listener discretion is advised.
Hi everyone, I'm Tanya.
And I'm Talia.
And we are Crimes and Consequences, a true crime podcast. Hi, Shannon.
Hey, Tanya. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Not bad. How about you?
Same. I'm loving this weather change.
Me too, right? No more summer. So, yeah.
It's the best. It's nice.
Yeah. So I have part 2 of the Michael Malloy story to tell everyone.
I cannot wait.
I know you were on the edge of your seat.
Oh, I've been thinking about him, about that alcohol and the wood grain and just the constant, these guys just not giving up in his true intestinal fortitude of this man.
Right? It's amazing.
Yes.
Before I get into it, I would just like to remind everyone to hit subscribe or follow on whatever app you're listening to. And part 2, I'm going to remind everyone where we left off in case, it's been a week since you've listened, or it could be like a year since you've listened to it, because we could in the future.
Yes.
So I introduced Joseph Patrick Murray. He was 31 years old. He was looking for work at the time. He stumbled his way into Marino's bar, and he kind of looked like Michael Malloy. So what the murder trust did was they put Nicholas Mallory's ID in his pocket, and they were getting ready to do something with him. Okay. Remember they had that plan where they were going to hold Michael up and then the car was going to run at him and they were going to let go of him. Right.
Yes.
So they did that with Joseph Murray. And they get back in their car, like the car hits Joseph Murray. They all pile back into probably Hershey's cab and whatever. So now they're convinced that Joseph Murray is dead. But they found themselves in the same situation that they were in with Michael Malloy, because the last place they had left him, the last time they had seen him, they left him in the street. Remember?
Right. Yes.
And they'd left him with Nicholas Mallory's ID in his pocket. So, they're wondering like, okay, did Joseph Murray die? Is Michael dead? Hershey turned in the cab that night to his employer after having driven 10 hours and only making $1.40 in fare.
Little suspicious. Right?
Yeah, a little suspicious. So he walks into the office to turn in the key, and he found a message from his boss that Detective Lloyd had stopped by to discuss some things with him. So going to Marino's speakeasy that night, Hershey brought the note with him that his boss had left him about this detective wanting to talk to him. He brings it and he hands it over to Tough Tony Maglione. Boy. So when Hershey went to the police station to meet with Detective Lloyd, Tough Tony waited in the car. And when Hershey came out, he relayed that a witness had reported seeing his cab run over a pedestrian, which happened to be Joseph Murray. Right.
No.
So after they talked to him, they let Hershey go, and Hershey and Tough Tony drove to Tony Marino's house to wake him up and tell him about this news that, guess what? Joseph Murray survived.
No. Yeah. Oh my gosh. This trust.
Yes. They're fucking it up all over the place.
They are Keystone Cops about it.
So they're not able to collect any insurance money on his death.
Oh my goodness.
So I'll tell you about another guy. So his name is Valen Jenkins. He worked nights at a feed company, stacking bags of feed and processing orders. One night while he's performing his mundane tasks, he sees 2 men pulling a third guy out of a cab and holding him up, and this car is running at him. Okay. So he's the witness who sees Hershey driving his cab into Joseph Murray.
Right.
So he took note of the license plate before the cab screeched away, and he called emergency services, and he turned in the license plate number to the cops. Joseph Murray ended up remaining in the hospital with his injuries for 45 days. He was injured that bad. Yeah.
Oh, I bet run over by a car, hit.
Yes.
I bet you he backed over him. It was not going to be pretty.
Right. The hospital staff found the Nicholas Mallory ID on Joseph Murray, and the hospital staff turned it over to the police.
Good.
So when Red began calling hospitals and morgues to find out, the whereabouts of Joseph Mallory, there was no patient or body or anything associated.
Right.
So Frank Pasqua, remember him?
Yes.
He was becoming more and more irritated with the incompetencies that were surrounding
incompetence. That's a good, awesome word for this.
Surrounding this murder plan.
Brother.
And he was anxious. He just really wanted to have it done. So he reached out to a man named Dr. Frank Manzella. And he was a man that Frank had often used to sign death certificates in his funeral business.
Mm-hmm.
So he quietly discloses the plot that they had come up with to murder Michael Malloy. And he discloses this to Dr. Manzella. And he says, I'll give you $150 if you sign the death certificate of any individual who ends up dead, as long as the name Nicholas Mallory is on the death certificate.
Right.
So Dr. Manzella, because everybody's hurting for a buck, he says, sure, I'll do this.
I'll do it.
And now Frank Pasqua, he's working on a new murder scheme.
Oh.
Yeah. The new scheme was that Tony Marino, the owner of the speakeasy, he was going to look for a room to rent that had a gas jet installed in the wall. So what they were going to do is they were going to bring their victim into the room. They were going to attach a hose to the gas and then have that person breathe in the gas and die from gas poisoning. And, once they were dead, Frank was going to call the doctor to write up the death certificate. And then, ka-ching, they'd have their Nicholas Mallory and it would be done.
These guys are so fucking stupid. I mean, you're going to rent a room to asphyxiate. I just keep like a freaking mouse trap. No one can be direct.
Yeah.
Bunch of pussies. I think geez, Lou, everyone's probably a drunk. Oh boy.
It's elaborate. It's elaborate, right?
And it's to keep thinking so highly of yourself. Yeah. I'm going to make another plan.
And I'm not going to get caught, right?
Yes, I'm going to tell another person because loose lips.
Right? We're going to let one more person in on the secret, right? There's now like 50 people who know. Right?
Idiots. Yeah. Right.
Fortunately for the guys, for this murder trust, they didn't have to wait long before they focused on a new victim. So 2 weeks after leaving Michael Malloy's body in the gutter, the man the New York Evening Post would eventually call Michael Iron Mike Mallory shuffled in back into the bar and he asked Red to pour him a drink. So Red instinctively reaches for this bottle of paint thinner and Michael Malloy has showed up and he takes a swig. Tony sat next to Michael and playing the concerned friend, he's like, dude, where have you been? Right? So Michael only remembered part of the story. He said he woke up in the gutter screaming for help. He later was found by a policeman while standing in the gutter yelling, and he was covered in blood. An ambulance took him to Fordham Hospital where he was found to have a fractured skull, a fractured shoulder, a concussion, and alcoholism apparently was a diagnosis. So he'd been in the hospital for only 5 days. When Red and Daniel Kriesberg went out looking for an apartment for their kill room, they were in a rush that now they had the victim again. They have Michael. Yeah. So they go out to find this room to rent. Tough Tony had given them one of his counterfeit $20 bills.
Always handy.
Yeah. Exactly. And the room they decided to rent was at an address of 1210 Fulton Avenue. The landlady was Dahlia Murphy. She was home when they knocked on her door. And Red introduced himself as Joseph Mallory, and he asked about the room to rent. In the 4th floor walk-up, they reached a room, finding a bare space with nothing but a bed, a small table, a chest of drawers, a lamp, and the gas spigot. So they said, yes, this is the room we would like to rent. And they paid Mrs. Murphy, thanked her, and they went on their way back to the speakeasy to report what they'd done. So according to certain stories recounting the members' involvement, Tough Tony devised a plan to get Michael Malloy in the room and get him gassed. By the time the arrests took place, Tough Tony had been killed, so he was unable to defend himself, but this is the story that was told.
Okay.
So on February 22nd, 1933, Red was behind the counter at the speakeasy. Tony Marino sat in a corner. Tough Tony sat at a table, and Michael Malloy had taken his place at the bar. Red gave Michael Malloy the whiskey bottle. Daniel Kriesberg showed up to see Red and Tough Tony pouring Michael Malloy drinks. Tough Tony took it upon himself to speed things up, and he challenged Michael Malloy to a drinking contest.
Ugh.
They replaced the whiskey with the wood alcohol, and Red took his place pouring drinks for Michael Malloy and Tough Tony. Draining their glasses shot after shot, it took about 20 minutes and nearly 2 quarts of paint thinner before Michael Malloy drooped on the stool and sunk to the floor. Once he was unconscious, Tony Marino told Red to carry Michael Malloy to the apartment. He was given a small bottle of wood alcohol as he walked out of the speakeasy, and he tucked it in his pocket. Around 9:30 that evening, Joseph Malloy, Red, reached his landlady's door with his brother Nicholas in tow. And Mrs. Murphy, Dahlia, later told investigators that Nicholas was frothing at the mouth as her tenant carried him up to his apartment and put him to bed.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
That's terrible.
I know,
I just feel so bad for this guy.
Right? Torture.
Absolutely.
Cool. So it wasn't long after he laid down that Michael Malloy started groaning, a sign that consciousness was near. Red pulled the bottle out of his pocket and he left it on the table for Michael before heading back to the speakeasy. Once he got there, Tony Marino told Daniel Kriesberg, who was sitting playing pinochle with Tough Tony, that he needed to go to the apartment with Red and make sure he's gone, meaning Michael. So Red followed him out the door and the men walked back to the apartment together. They went up and closed and locked the door behind them once they got in the room. Daniel Kriesberg brought a pistol with him and he aimed it at Michael with one hand while the other reached into his jacket pocket and took out a length of rubber pipe because they're going to asphyxiate him now with the gas. Pulling their victim onto the floor, Daniel Kriesberg attached one end of the hose to the gas outlet and put the other end in Michael's mouth. He pulled a towel out of another pocket and wrapped it around Michael's face to hold any excess gas that might escape his mouth. And then he turned on the nozzle and let the gas flow into Michael's lungs. It took not even 5 minutes for Michael to finally stop breathing, and Daniel turned the gas off. The two men, Daniel and Red, stayed in the room for 5 more minutes. Probably just to make sure Michael was finally dead. Because he's like,
for sure. Yes.
The undead. He's like the zombie that's
yes, to make sure.
Daniel declared him dead shortly after, and then he put the gun away. He removed the towel and shoved the rubber hose into his pocket before they left to go back to the speakeasy, leaving Michael on the floor of the apartment. Once they reached the speakeasy, Tony approached Daniel to find out what had happened. Relaying everything, Daniel let the men in the bar know that Michael was finally dead. Tony Marino then ordered Red to head back up to the apartment and sleep with the corpse the night. Yeah. So the landlady wouldn't know what happened until the morning.
Right.
Additionally, after as many times as they thought they'd been successful, it was better to be safe and ensure that Michael was in fact dead.
Right.
So Red agreed to do this because he has this opportunity to sleep in an actual bed.
Oh, wow.
Something that didn't happen very often. You know, I don't think he had a place to crash. I think he crashed at the bar a lot.
Right.
With the news of Michael's death, Frank Pasqua went about arranging the plan for the doctor and other witnesses to make it seem more legitimate for the landlady. Around 8 o'clock the following morning, Joseph Malloy said good morning to Mrs. Murphy, after which she inquired about how his brother was doing. He told her, "Don't bother my brother, he's really sick." So he let her know he'd be back shortly, and he walked onto the street and he went back to the speakeasy. When he returned to the apartment, Frank came with him. So Frank introduces himself to Mrs. Murphy, the landlady.
Mhm.
He introduced himself as the undertaker, and he informed her that there would be a doctor coming by shortly, and Joseph Mallory took the mortician up to the fourth floor apartment. Now, I don't know, like in between, like did she find out he was dead? Because as far as
Yeah.
she knew, he was just sick, but I don't know. But this is what happened. Around 9 o'clock, Dr. Manzella knocked at Mrs. Murphy's door asking where the patient was, and she took him to the top floor and the door of Michael Malloy's room.
Right.
The doctor briefly looked over the patient and declared him dead. The cause of death would be lobar pneumonia. They were not going to be collecting on the double indemnity, the accident clause.
Mm.
And he told Frank to swing by his office later that morning for the death certificate. Frank covered the body with a sheet and told Red that he was going to go to the health department and to request body removal.
Okay.
Dr. Manzella prepared the death certificate for Frank to pick up around noon. When he stopped by Dr. Manzella's office, he looked it over and noted the cause of death for Nicholas Mallory before heading to the apartment to await Michael Malloy's removal and transport to the mortuary. So when a body normally would arrive at Frank Pasqua's funeral parlor, it would be embalmed and prepped for burial. Then it would be washed and dressed in nice clothing. Someone would come and comb the hair and apply makeup, and someone would pick out the casket and the gravesite. With the murder trust victim, none of that ended up happening. No family member was there to view the body or select a casket, no one to wash him up. But Frank would still be charging for it. He rolled the cheapest wooden box over next to the slab that Michael's body was resting on, and he rolled Michael into it before closing the lid. The bill Frank sent to the insurance company was nothing less than a pure fiction.
Yeah.
It included a funeral procession, flower arrangements, and a suit. Frank was looking at making over $340 on
my
funeral.
Gosh.
Right?
Wow.
The next morning, February 24th, 2 days after Michael was murdered, Frank Pasqua went to the Department of Health and filed the death certificate. On this day, too, Michael Malloy was laid to rest in the St. Francis section of the cemetery, which was set aside for charity graves. The headstone was small and said nothing but Nicholas Mallory. The very next day, Frank and Red set out to achieve their payday. Now they got to file this with the insurance company.
Right.
So visiting the offices of Metropolitan Life, Frank helped Joseph Mallory, Red, Nicholas's brother, fill out the proof of death statement for the $800. Using the apartment as a mailing address, the claim was filed and the check was issued on March 1st to Joseph Mallory. It arrived in the mail soon after, and Red took it straight to Marino's place. Frank received the news shortly after and came right over in his car to take the men to cash the check. Leaving the Metropolitan offices with a wad of bills, Red held them tightly before handing them over to Tony Marino once he reached the car. Frank quickly drove off while Tony counted the money. Red got $65. Tough Tony got $65.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Daniel Kriesberg walked away with $50, and many of the participants would have to wait for their cuts until the prudential policies were collected.
Oh my goodness.
This is ridiculous.
It really is.
The same day they'd filed the claims at Metropolitan, they'd gone to Prudential. The agent asked Frank when a good time for him would be to come view the body to verify Frank's claim. When Frank disclosed that the body had already been buried, the red flags at Prudential went up.
I bet.
Yeah, right. In March 1933, Adolph Coldway was assigned to investigate the claims on Nicholas Mallory's policies. Starting off, he visited the house claimed to be the residence of the policyholder. That was actually Frank's real address.
Right.
Asking around the neighborhood, no one said they had heard of Nicholas Mallory. Going backwards, he decided to begin at the address Mr. Mallory had died at. There he was able to get some information from the landlady. She shared stories of the men who came to rent the room and the man whom they brought back with them, frothing at the mouth. The agent thanked Mrs. Murphy and went to see if anyone else knew anything. By the time the interviews were over, the agent had gotten many different stories from many different people in the few days he'd been working on the case, because they're all dipshits. Wow. So
yeah.
On March 10th, he decided to stop by Frank's burial service and interviewed the man who had insured the deceased.
Okay. Smart.
Walking into the business, Frank shook the man's hand and invited him in. When Adolf introduced himself, the air just changed in the room.
Oh, I
He's
bet.
like, oh, fuck. Frank was caught off guard and immediately ushered the visitor to his office, where Adolf got to work right away. During his interview or inquiry, Adolf asked several questions regarding Frank's relationship with the insured, and he wrote every answer down.
Right.
He took really good notes. Adolf found it difficult to read Frank. He asked about Joseph Malloy. Frank said that the deceased's brother and he lived in the apartment building run by Mrs. Murphy. And this is where things start to fall apart because they just fucking lied about everything.
Oh, my God. They can't keep up. Yeah.
Right. So, you know, Adolf had met with Mrs. Murphy, the landlady, earlier in the week, and he knew that Joseph Malloy wasn't living there. And here's Frank telling him he does.
Oh, he lives over there. Yeah.
Yeah, right, sure. He was just using the apartment, I mean, obviously his mailing address.
Yes.
So with this information, Adolf informed Frank that he'd like to meet Joseph Malloy to get all the facts straight, just merely as a formality.
Sure. And then I'll be out of your hair.
You know, then just this little meeting and then we'll be done.
That's it.
That's it. The meeting was set for March 13th. So now it's March 13th, and Joseph Malloy arrived at the Prudential office for the meeting with Frank in tow. When asked why he felt the need to attend, Frank defended himself, saying he was there to help Joseph because the man wasn't well versed in business matters.
Oh.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, just helping my friend.
Helping my friend.
It's my kind heart showing.
He wore it on his sleeve.
Yes, he did.
He assured the Prudential employees that his only interest in the policies was ensuring the funeral home got paid. During the questioning, Red did his best to create a story that the insurance company would accept. He said, you know, his brother was a man addicted to alcohol. He was sleeping on the streets. He really wanted to help his brother out. So he got him a room to help get him his life straight.
Sure.
It was enough to tug on the heartstrings, as you can imagine. But Adolf was unaffected. He pointed out the signatures on the policy and asked if they were sure those signatures belonged to Malloy. And Frank said yes. And as the meeting was ending, Adolf asked for an itemized copy of the undertaker's bill, hoping to get a signature to compare to the policies.
Nice.
Thanking the two men for their time, Adolf told him that would be all. You know, I'm done. On March 25th, he received an undertaker's bill from Frank as requested. The entire bill was typed, including Frank's name at the bottom.
Oh, my Frank.
There was
Frank's first rodeo, right?
I know, right? Frank's not stupid.
Yeah, exactly.
Although they are all stupid.
I mean, they are stupid. Yes, Frank.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go. Good way to go, Frank, on the typing. Good job.
Yeah, good job. Late on Sunday, March 19th, Tough Tony and Joe Maglione sat at a table in the speakeasy arguing over the split of the insurance money. Joe got up to use the bathroom and minutes later opened the flimsy partition with a gun drawn aimed right at Tough Tony.
Oh my
He
God.
walked right up to his business partner and fired one shot. Tough Tony staggered and he shot again, and Tough Tony fell to the floor. When Joe went to grab the pistol that Tough Tony had on his body, Tough Tony jumped up and ran out the door, and Joe was chasing him down the street with his gun drawn, and he fired 4 more shots. 2 of them hit Tough Tony, and one of those got him right in the heart.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. The authorities started interviewing witnesses, and they happened upon Red, who'd been serving drinks that night at Marino's. While he couldn't tell them much about what had happened, he claimed the argument the men were having was mostly in Italian. So the officers took Red into the station as a material witness of the killings. So the house of cards is starting to crumble.
Yes, it is crumbling.
Joe would go on to tell the police that Tough Tony had challenged his manhood, calling him yellow and afraid. He said Tough Tony had frequented a few speakeasies and told some mutual associates that Joe needed a backbone. These
Oh.
rumors swirled and they reached Joe. When he confronted Tough Tony at Marino's place, things got heated, quite quickly. Things escalated. So regardless of what Red witnessed, Joe would insist that he shot Tough Tony in self-defense.
Oh.
Red slept in a cell for material witnesses. They kept him like at the police station.
Overnight, yeah.
Yeah, overnight. He slept there for days.
Oh.
After spending a childhood in institutions and foster homes, he really didn't enjoy being locked up. Though he couldn't be angry to have a bed and 3 square meals a day, he just didn't want to be there.
Right.
And so he kept to himself. He'd get food in the cafeteria and bring it back to his cell. He refused to talk to any other people there. And Tony had gotten a paper the following day which detailed the shooting.
Yeah.
And listed Red as a witness who would end up taking the stand for the police.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And to make matters worse, Adolf, the insurance investigator, was still sniffing around. So Adolf was having a difficult time finding Joseph Mallory to question him.
Right.
Obviously, because the man doesn't exist.
Yes. Like, what is that movie with Red and Andy?
Yeah.
He only exists on paper.
He only exists on paper. Right. When he brought it up to an agent at Prudential, the agent told Adolf that the man he was looking for worked as a bartender at Marino's speakeasy. In late March, Adolf walked into the bar. Marino was wiping down the countertops. And except for these 2 men, the establishment was empty. The few customers were scared off after Tough Tony's murder. So people weren't, because it happened, initially
right there. Yeah.
Adolf asked for Joseph Mallory, and Tony said he'd left for Philadelphia for an extended vacation, but he would put them in touch when Joseph returned from his trip. When Adolf later approached Frank with the same question, Frank relayed the same details as Tony to a disconcerting extent. It was almost like it was exact.
Scripted, yeah.
Yes, very scripted. However, if Adolf asked anyone else about the Mallory brothers, no one had even heard of them.
Oh,
just
but
Tony,
these 2 guys, yes.
Yeah, just Tony and
Frank.
To cause an even bigger puzzle, when Adolf looked at Frank's bill for the Nicholas Mallory funeral, it made little sense that a man so few people knew would have such an extravagant burial service, right? On April 3rd, 1933, Joe Maglione was indicted by grand jury for the murder of Anthony Tough Tony Bastoni. He was arraigned 4 days later, and he pled not guilty. Soon after the indictment, Harry Hershey Green was arrested for carrying a concealed handgun. He was thrown into Bronx County Jail with Joe and Red. Later on, Daniel Kriesberg would be taken in after being arrested, relating to the Pants Bandit robberies. Remember I told you that? He was with that other woman. They were taking their pants. Yeah.
So crazy.
I know. When things started to unravel, Tony Marino decided to hire one of his cousins to look after his bar for $1 a day, incorrectly thinking that physical space from the bar would translate to space between him and the insurance investigation. Frank took to perfecting a story in case the men in jail developed loose lips.
Sure.
However, Mike Mallory's story was making the rounds in the boroughs of New York. A story about a man who couldn't be killed. Not by drink, not by poison, not by being hit by a car. The story also, he was right.
Nothing's bringing this guy.
The story also included greedy villains who would continue to try to kill him until they succeeded. The story on the streets would reach a police patrolman as he walked the beat.
Right.
And it would eventually the story eventually made its way up to the inspector of the homicide squad, who then brought it to the attention of the Bronx County District Attorney, Samuel J. Foley, who immediately opened an investigation.
Wow.
John McNally had been brought into the murder trust early on as part of the contingency plan. I don't know if you remember me telling you about him, but he was like hired in case like they needed to kill somebody.
Oh, okay. Little backup.
So yeah, if Michael had become a problem, John McNally and his partner Ed Smith would bump him off, is basically, remember it was like a safety net.
Yeah.
In April 1933, John McNally had been arrested for carrying a concealed weapon, and realizing his history of criminal activity was putting him up for a long stay in prison, he was looking for a way to secure himself a deal.
Sure.
Yep. There's no honor among thieves, is what they say.
I was just thinking that, girl. There is no honor among thieves.
Mm-hmm. The last week of April, District Attorney Foley and John McNally pulled up a chair, and John told him of a meeting he'd had with an undertaker and a speakeasy owner where the murder of a homeless alcoholic man was discussed. Policemen were sent to bars to listen to the stories and directed to not mock the unbelievability of what was being said. They noted names, dates, and other sources that agreed with John McNally's version of events. Right. So with several of the suspects involved already behind bars for unrelated crimes, it wasn't as difficult as it could have been to put things together. And since these men were already behind bars, they didn't have a clue that their plot was being pulled wide open.
Yes. Different angles. They're, taking down that house of cards.
Right? Yeah, that house of cards is falling hard.
Oh.
Eventually, District Attorney Foley had put together where Nicholas Mallory was buried and worked to have the body exhumed.
Ooh.
Yeah. May 11th, 1933, the police entered Ferncliff Cemetery with a court order to exhume grave number 2070, where Nicholas Mallory had been buried. The body was taken to Fordham Hospital for an autopsy. Around 7:45 in the evening, a detective brought John McNally to the morgue. They asked him, "Do you know the man on the table?" And John nodded. They asked him, "Is that the man you knew to be insured and buried under the name Nicholas Mallory?" And John said, "That's him." They said, "Did you know him under any other name?" And John said, "I knew him by his real name." Well, what was that? And he said, "Michael Malloy." So now, okay, the roof is blown off.
I was just going to say, yep. I can't even wait to see how this unpacks now. It's going to keep getting faster.
The dominoes are falling.
Yes, they are.
The autopsy began around 9 p.m. that night. The doctor made notes as he examined the external parts of the body. He recorded when his first cuts into the victim were made, and he took blood samples, mixing them in a tube with sodium hydroxide. When mixed with sodium hydroxide, blood not containing carbon monoxide would change color to greenish brown or black. If the blood does contain carbon monoxide and is mixed with that chemical, the mixture would stay red. So it was clear within seconds that the cause of death on the death certificate was false.
Yeah.
That man had not died of lobar pneumonia, but by asphyxiation by carbon monoxide.
I had no idea that there was a test that, not that I know a lot about embalming a body or anything like that, but I had no idea, other than a drug panel. I know they can sense when arsenic or poisons have been used, but I didn't know there was an asphyxiation test. That's pretty interesting.
It is interesting. And this just goes to show, I don't think he was embalmed. I mean, he still had blood that they extracted.
Yeah.
Right?
I don't think Frank put any money into him except for that cheap box.
Right. That's exactly
terrible.
Yeah. Also on May 11th, the police knocked on Tony Marino's door. When they asked him if he had anything to say, he said no. The police asked Tony a few more questions, but Tony wasn't forthcoming. Tired of being drug along, the officer asked him directly, "Where is Michael Malloy?" Tony lied and told him the last time he'd seen Malloy was in the hospital back in January when Michael had sought treatment for an open sore on his leg. He said he hadn't seen or heard from him since. So on the surface, Tony kept it together, but his insides were shaking like all hell.
Oh, I bet he's shitting his pants.
Right?
You're always living in I have PTSD, and I can just imagine him just being on red alert, always fight or flight. That's taxing on the body. And Didn't you say in the very beginning he has like several venereal diseases?
Yep.
And so
Yep.
that's not good either.
Yeah, that's not good either.
But one more thing that's bad on the body.
Right. This was the first time that Michael Malloy's name had been brought up during questioning. So they asked him again, is this the truth? And Tony answered that it was. The policeman replied, informing Tony that Michael was dead. Detectives were at Ferncliff Cemetery digging him up as they spoke, and Tony stood his ground that he was telling the truth. They drove to District Attorney Foley's to let him know what had been said, and Foley decided to have Red brought in for questioning.
Oh boy, here we go.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Around 4:20 that afternoon, Red made his way to the interrogation room. During Foley's questioning, he just spilled his guts, okay? Substantiating John McNally's stories. He named names, and he disclosed that he'd been in the car when Michael was ran over.
Oh my goodness.
He also revealed that Joe and Tough Tony had been arguing about the split of the insurance money when Tough Tony was killed. He laid out the entire scheme for the DA, explaining that he was supposed to pretend to be Michael Malloy's brother, Joseph Mallory, and that they had also attempted to kill another man in Michael Mallory's place. And that was one part of the plan that the police hadn't discovered yet.
Wow.
So Red is just, his lips are a-flapping, right?
Almost validates everything he's been saying when he drops new information. Yeah. He's been checking the boxes off. This is gravy.
Around 7:45, John McNally was brought into the morgue where he identified the body of Nicholas Mallory, and he identified it as Michael Malloy for the detectives. That evening, both Tony Marino and Frank Pasqua were picked up and brought in for questioning. The men were not as forthcoming, obviously, with information as Red had been. Yeah. The battle of wits taking place in the interrogation room was an Olympic feat. As they both tried to omit facts, they created stories, and they placed the blame on anyone else but them. After numerous questions went by without any answers at all, DA Foley asked, "Are you afraid that answering these questions might incriminate you?" And Tony Marino answered, "Yes, I have no lawyer." And then he said, "Do you need a lawyer to tell the truth?" I mean, do you?
Yeah.
So Tony wasn't going to talk. After 2 hours of this verbal battle, Tony was excused to a holding cell. Daniel Kriesberg was now brought in for interrogation, and like Red, he would lay it all out for the police, attempting to play on their sympathies, telling them that the gang had threatened him. He told the whole story from the beginning and even admitted he was there when Michael Malloy was gassed. At the end of his story, he was taken back to his cell. Frank was different. He'd prepped for this for weeks.
He's been in the death game for years as an undertaker. And in that time, I'm not trying to give undertakers any kind of negative name, but also it's, consider the times, how far they and the checks and balances of such a business.
Right. He had been strangely absent at the more violent of the attempts on Michael Malloy's life. Many of the men in the group had noticed he wasn't taking part in certain activities, but in their eyes, he'd taken out the policies, he'd taken care of the funeral. So his hands were as dirty as theirs.
Oh, absolutely.
But Frank was also thoughtful and intelligent. He'd mentally gone over his story hundreds of times and realized that his triumph would lie in maintaining that he'd never met Michael Malloy. He'd only ever known Nicholas Mallory.
Okay.
During the questioning, when asked if he'd known Michael Malloy, he denied it. Okay. Pushing, DA Foley stated, "He's the man you buried under the name Mallory." Frank countered, "I know Mallory, but I don't know Mike Malloy." DA Foley asked about Mallory's brother. Frank came right back saying that it was Red, the man who worked behind the bar at Marino's. DA Foley clarified that Red was Joe Murphy, and Frank feigned that he didn't know Red wasn't Joseph. What?
Joe, what? You know what reminds me of is that Chris Farley and David Spade. What'd you do when he drove
Tommy Boy?
Tommy Boy, yes. What?
what'd you do?
Big guy in a little coat.
I love that movie.
Me too.
So D.A. Foley said that it was Red. His name is Joe Murphy. And Frank's like, what? He said, I didn't know that he was Joseph Mallory, saying that Red had met him at the apartment when he took the body away and had told him Nicholas Mallory was his brother. When asked if he'd like to make any confession, Frank stated, I have no confession to make. D.A. Foley shared the facts he'd been given by John McNally, Red, and Daniel Kriesberg, while Frank continued to deny any involvement in this.
Wow, he is standing. He is dug in.
Yeah.
Oh.
After hours of questioning, Frank got tired and careless. He slipped. In one single answer about Mallory visiting Dr. Manzella, Frank said, Mallory told me.
Oh.
So D.A. Foley questioned, you mean Mike? Yes, he answered quietly, knowing he'd been caught in a trap. As he floundered and flailed, trying to recover, D.A. Foley decided to give him one last chance to allow Frank to give his narrative, his side of the story.
Right.
Once it was on record, D.A. Foley knew he could tear it apart piece by piece. Frank would only admit to obtaining the life insurance policies. He would never confess to being any part of the murder ploy.
Yeah, the murder trust of
yes, the murder trust. After Frank finished crafting his tale, D.A. Foley pulled out the itemized bill that he had sent to Prudential, having obtained it from Adolf. He questioned why Frank would have sent in a bill to Prudential when he'd already been paid by Metropolitan. He also clarified the items in the bill that hadn't happened: the funeral procession, the embalming, the extravagant casket. The bill was completely false. Frank blamed everything on Tough Tony Bastoni and Tony Marino, saying they'd strong-armed him.
Bully. Yes.
Right. The following day, after D.A. Foley received the results regarding the carbon monoxide test, his patience is like
done.
Thin.
Yes. This fuckery.
Right? Yeah. He'd had enough, right?
Yeah.
He called Tony Marino in. After making no further gains during this round of interrogation, he brought Red up to the room and let them bicker with each other in front of him, preferring this method to exhausting himself, trying to pull information out of Tony.
Trying to ask the right question. And
yeah. When Red was taken back to his cell, Tony made himself comfortable. He told the closest thing resembling the truth that he could without actually telling the truth. Around 2 a.m, Tony asked for a break. May 12th, 1933, D.A. Foley finally announced the scheme to the media. It was called, quote, one of the most diabolical plots for profit in the annals of the city, end quote. The Home News, which was a newspaper, released an article detailing the entire sordid tale. The investigation following the release of the story led to the search for Joseph Murray, whom the murder trust had attempted to kill. Remember, he was that other guy they hit.
Yeah.
He would eventually be tracked down in time to testify as a material witness during the trial. There were also questions coming to the surface regarding the suspicious death of Mabel Carlson. Remember, she was Tony Marino's
Marino,
whose murder would not make it to trial.
Oh.
Prosecuting the case himself, the indictments were rushed. Red, Tony Marino, Frank Pasqua, Daniel Kriesberg, Joe Maglione, and Hershey Green were arraigned and held without bail. Wow. Dr. Manzella was arrested, but released on $10,000 bail.
$10,000.
It was like $1 million, probably. It was probably so funny.
$1 million.
It had to be like close to $1 million, right? On Tuesday, May 16th, a grand jury convened. The DA had more than 20 witnesses. The testimony was so damaging that there was no question that they were going to receive the electric chair.
Wow.
The witnesses would recount every disaster of the murder attempts, every painful detail of their failures in an attempt to satisfy their greed. The indictments were returned the same day, shortly after the final witness testified. Murder in the first degree for all but Dr. Manzella, who was indicted on accessory after the fact, and failing to notify the medical examiner and police of Michael Malloy's death.
Right.
While awaiting trial, Hershey Green, who had seen very little value in human life up to that point, all of a sudden saw the value in his own.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, shit. We're going to save my own ass. Right.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. Did he turn to the Lord?
Yeah.
Did he get religion?
No, he didn't hit religion, but he turned as a state's witness.
State's witness. Okay.
As did Joe Maglione after running into Tony at the barbershop in jail and exchanging some harsh words. October 3rd, 1933, the jury was seated for the trial. The prosecution began laying out their case on October 4th, and the defense opened their side on Friday, the 13th of October.
Cool.
An
A
omen.
little ominous. Yes.
With closing arguments beginning first thing on October 18th. At 7:15 that night, the jury was handed the case. At 4:15 a.m. the morning of October 19th, they had finally reached a verdict. So it took them about 7 hours. Each man was found guilty and sentenced to the electric chair.
Wow.
DA Foley stated to the press, "I think it was a proper verdict for a most cruel murder, which was inspired by nothing more than sordid greed."
Yes, I totally agree. I mean,
Right?
what? For sure.
Early Saturday, October 21st, the men were transferred to Sing Sing prison. When they were relieved of their possessions, it was found the four men had $16.05 between them. Their appeals dragged on, and on 3 occasions, the men escaped the electric chair with mere hours to spare.
Wow.
I know. Eventually, though, their luck ran out. And the Home News, which was a newspaper, reported, quote, 4 members of the murder trust who were convicted of one of the most brutal murders in the history of the Bronx are scheduled to die in the electric chair sometime after 11 o'clock tonight, end quote. It was reported by the Daily Mirror that as the clock ticked closer to their end, the men carried themselves with decreasing dignity.
I bet.
Yeah.
I bet.
They were losing their shit.
Tanya, I mean, honestly, okay, all 4 are going at the same time. They don't got 4 chairs, I'm pretty sure.
Right?
I'm only basing my knowledge on the Green Mile.
Yeah.
So you are saying that you're listening to your cohorts and the light flickering. I go first. I'm not listening to nobody.
Yes, I would go
If
first.
I'm going to coward my whole life, cower me out first. Might as well finish off, you know? Oh my God.
I know. I don't want to be last. That chair is going to be warmed up, girl. You know?
And I'm not feeling sorry for them at all. Not fucking for 1 second. But I'm just saying, you know, how you just put yourself, what would I do? What was, you know, what am I deciding? Short straw. I do not care.
I know. I wonder how they decided. Like,
oh my goodness.
Alphabetical. I don't know. Yeah, right.
Zodiac signs. What's going on?
Yeah. So it was Dr. Amos Baker's job to assess the mental state of each prisoner and determine who would be put to death first. Okay.
Oh boy.
It was protocol for the weakest man to be the lead off in those situations. And in this group, it was determined to be Frank, who was an emotional wreck.
I was going to say, what? He pissed himself?
Yeah, fuck him.
You know.
Right? You did all this bullshit, got a fucking doctor, did all this stuff.
And he had a good script.
Everybody.
He was the biggest fugazi out of them all. The one who seemed like he had his shit together and now is a puddle of goo.
Right.
On the accountability. Right.
I know. Between 11:01 and 11:18 on June 7th, 1934, the conspirators were led to the chair. As one body was wheeled out, the next man was brought in to take his place.
Crazy.
I know.
Can you imagine that today? I'm sorry. I'm just like blown away for one time. And Alabama can't get the right injection medicine. We've not really made any good progress in this kind of.
No, and the electric chair was brutal. And back in the 30s, when you committed a crime like this, they fucking fried your ass right away. I mean, there was no like
20 yeyears.
Yeah, 20 years. Like you committed this crime 20 years ago and you finally, you know, are getting your death sentence carried out. But it was brutal. I did a story once. I can't remember which one it was called, but I did a story about how someone was put to death and it was totally fucked up by the electric chair. Like it was a nightmare.
The Green Mile gives a good example of just one way it can be horribly cruel. And
right.
I can just pivot from there.
Warden Laws of Sing Sing turned to face the walls during the process in his silent protest of capital punishment. I guess the warden was not a fan.
Okay.
Robert Campbell would report the executions to be the state's toast to Mike the Durable.
No kidding.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, what? You can't stand a little electricity? I could handle
Mhm.
paint thinner.
Yeah, right.
Motherfuckers. Right.
During their later trials, Joe Maglione was sentenced to 5 years in Sing Sing for manslaughter, and Harry Hershey Green received 5 to 10 for felonious assault.
Okay.
So they did not see the death penalty. They did not meet Mr. Sparky.
Thank God. Well, I mean, and not thank God, because they, he still killed Tough Tony. You're still nefarious. You're in terrible. You're just in shitty energy when you're fucking taking advantage of somebody, and then you're around all that necrotic energy, and it's just terrible.
Yeah. So that is my part 2 of the Unsinkable Michael Malloy. Is what
I can't believe how these guys, you're standing someone up in a T formation and just revving of the car, the hose in the mouth.
I know.
What is that? How dumb? I just can't believe the cowardice. They think they're so close. Terrible. God bless Mike Malloy, and it's a good Irish part.
Yeah.
I'm so partial to the Irish.
I just can't believe the wood alcohol, the what was it? It was
paint thinner. Yeah, it was wood alcohol. Yeah.
Like, I can't believe that didn't kill him. He was drinking so much of it
to where he could just pass out. And now, your body is only going to take so much, and it's a miracle for him. He truly did deserve his name. Tough Tony, eat a dick. Make room for Mike. Mighty Mike.
Exactly.
Off my ass.
Well, thank you, Shannon, for listening, and thank you, everyone, for listening to this week's episode. If you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe or follow button on whatever app you're listening to. We have a website, crimesandconsequences.com. You can find merchandise there. We also have some of the episodes. We also are on social media, but it's been a while since we posted, but we're on Instagram and Facebook at Hardcore True Crime. If you would like more episodes, because you love us so much, we do offer one extra episode a week that you can get if you subscribe to our Patreon. You go to patreon.com/TNT Crimes. You can sign up there. Or if you listen through the Apple Podcast app, you can subscribe there. And for a mere $8 a month, you get one episode a week extra.
Of great stories, great coverage.
Great stories. So, all right, Shannon. Well, until our next fabulous episode.
Yes, until we meet again, you take care. And you know how much I love you.
Oh, I love you too, girl.
All right. Bye, guys. Until we see you next time.
Yes, until next time. Bye.
Bye.